the new god of comedy, the new gods of comedy, a new god of comedy, the new goddess of comedy, the new goddesses of comedy, a new goddess of comedy, the old god of comedy, the old gods of comedy, a old god of comedy, the old goddess of comedy, the old goddesses of comedy, a old goddess of comedy, the greater god of comedy, the greater gods of comedy, a greater god of comedy, the greater goddess of comedy, the greater goddesses of comedy, a greater goddess of comedy, the lesser god of comedy, the lesser gods of comedy, a lesser god of comedy, the lesser goddess of comedy, the lesser goddesses of comedy, a lesser goddess of comedy, the greater spirit of comedy, the greater spirits of comedy, a greater spirit of comedy, the lesser spirit of comedy, the lesser spirits of comedy, a lesser spirit of comedy, the major god of comedy, the major gods of comedy, a major god of comedy, the major goddess of comedy, the major goddesses of comedy, a major goddess of comedy, the minor god of comedy, the minor gods of comedy, a minor god of comedy, the minor goddess of comedy, the minor goddesses of comedy, a minor goddess of comedy, the superior god of comedy, the superior gods of comedy, a superior god of comedy, the superior goddess of comedy, the superior goddesses of comedy, a superior goddess of comedy, the inferior god of comedy, the inferior gods of comedy, a inferior god of comedy, the inferior goddess of comedy, the inferior goddesses of comedy, a inferior goddess of comedy, the ancestor god of comedy, the ancestor gods of comedy, a ancestor god of comedy, the ancestor goddess of comedy, the ancestor goddesses of comedy, a ancestor goddess of comedy, the ascendant god of comedy, the ascendant gods of comedy, a ascendant god of comedy, the ascendant goddess of comedy, the ascendant goddesses of comedy, a ascendant goddess of comedy, the descendant god of comedy, the descendant gods of comedy, a descendant god of comedy, the descendant goddess of comedy, the descendant goddesses of comedy, a descendant goddess of comedy, the transcendent god of comedy, the transcendent gods of comedy, a transcendent god of comedy, the transcendent goddess of comedy, the transcendent goddesses of comedy, a transcendent goddess of comedy, the future god of comedy, the future gods of comedy, a future god of comedy, the future goddess of comedy, the future goddesses of comedy, a future goddess of comedy, the present god of comedy, the present gods of comedy, a present god of comedy, the present goddess of comedy, the present goddesses of comedy, a present goddess of comedy, the past god of comedy, the past gods of comedy, a past god of comedy, the past goddess of comedy, the past goddesses of comedy, a past goddess of comedy, the god of comedy, the gods of comedy, a god of comedy, the goddess of comedy, the goddesses of comedy, a goddess of comedy, the half god of comedy, the half gods of comedy, a half god of comedy, the half goddess of comedy, the half goddesses of comedy, a half goddess of comedy, the vessel of comedy, the vessels of comedy, a vessel of comedy, the person of comedy, the persons of comedy, a person of comedy, the image of comedy, the images of comedy, a image of comedy, the imagination of comedy, the imaginations of comedy, a imagination of comedy, the belief of comedy, the beliefs of comedy, a belief of comedy, the thought of comedy, the thoughts of comedy, a thought of comedy, the word of comedy, the words of comedy, a word of comedy, the action of comedy, the actions of comedy, a action of comedy, the reaction of comedy, the reactions of comedy, a reaction of comedy, the situation of comedy, the situations of comedy, a situation of comedy, the circumstance of comedy, the circumstances of comedy, a circumstance of comedy, the relationship of comedy, the relationships of comedy, a relationship of comedy, the number of comedy, the numbers of comedy, a number of comedy, the formula of comedy, the formulas of comedy, a formula of comedy, the equation of comedy, the equations of comedy, a equation of comedy, the symbol of comedy, the symbols of comedy, a symbol of comedy, the color of comedy, the colors of comedy, A color of comedy, the thing of comedy, the things of comedy, a thing of comedy, the way of comedy, the ways of comedy, a way of comedy, the place of comedy, the places of comedy, a place of comedy, the time of comedy, the times of comedy, a time of comedy, the event of comedy, the events of comedy, a event of comedy, the result of comedy, the results of comedy, a result of comedy,